when you approach historic preservation as preserving stories, which is what I really push for, then it becomes more than just preserving old buildings. It becomes a lot more than just preserving the best looking buildings. Because we really need to separate historic preservation from pretty things, because that's not the only thing. That's a good thing, but like there's so much more to it than that as well.
It's just such a pleasure and an honor to be here at Old South. I'm Susan Spurlock. I'm the Executive Director of Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University. I've had the privilege of leading this storied institution for 8 years. I'm happy to be back at Old South, where I've done quite a number of programs over the years. What a beautiful and historic site. So you're here, we're delighted you're here to be in conversation about Boston's historical architecture, an essential part of the city's enduring beauty and character. Boston's Oldest Buildings and Where to Find Them is the first book to dive into the city's 50 oldest buildings. The author, City Archaeologist Joe Bagley's narrative introduces readers to a Boston through maps, photographs, and an overview of the city's historic preservation movement. And to tell us a little bit more about this wonderful collaboration will be Sue Raymond, who will also introduce our evening speaker. So Sue Raymond, the director of the Brandeis University Press, please join me up here.
Well, hello everybody, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. I won't keep everybody long because we want to hear what Joe and Bob have to say, but to thank my co-sponsors of this event, Revolutionary Spaces and Ford Hall Forum, and to say I'm just delighted to be here and delighted to be publishing the second edition of Boston's Oldest Buildings and Where to Find Them. We published the first edition in 2021, and it did very well, and when we came to reprint it, I asked Joe if he wanted to make any changes, and he said, yes, I found 2 more oldest buildings. So we're looking forward to hearing more about those oldest buildings tonight. And I was thrilled that we have a wonderful foreword by historian at Suffolk University, Bob Allison, who will be talking with Joe and is also very much an expert on, obviously, history and revolution and buildings and preservation. So thank you, both of you, for being here. I have to say very proudly that Boston's Oldest Buildings and Where to Find Them won at the Historic New England Book Prize and also won a Boston Preservation Alliance award, which is usually given to buildings themselves and not usually to books. So I was particularly pleased about that one. And I'd like to introduce our distinguished guests more formally, and Joe and Bob will, through conversation and images, take us on a journey through Boston's history tonight. As we approach the 400th anniversary of the city's founding, which was in circa 1630, this compelling look at Boston's oldest buildings and where to find them lays the foundation for our shared understanding of the history's past, present, and future. And Joseph M. Bagley is the city archaeologist of Boston, a historic preservationist and a staff member of the Boston Landmarks Commission. He's worked for multiple local and state historic preservation offices, including the Maine Historic Preservation Commission and the Massachusetts Historical Commission. In 2016, we published his first award-winning book, A History of Boston in 50 Artifacts, also published by Brandeis University Press, which is a terrific little book. It's a terrific book because he takes different artifacts that he found and pieces together a real sort of social and real history of Boston. Robert J. Allison is professor of history at Suffolk University and a lecturer at the Harvard Extension School. He's president of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts and chair of Revolution 250. A life trustee of the USS Constitution Museum and elected fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society, Bob is the author of numerous books and articles, including A Short History of Boston and Revolutionary Sites of Greater Boston. Bob and Joe, welcome back to the Old South Meeting House. Thank you.
Hi, Bob.
Hi, Joe. Good to meet you.
Good to see you again.
So Joe, why don't you tell us why you wrote this book?
Sure. I felt like actually you were involved in the start of this book, believe it or not.
Really? Do I get royalties?
Yes, a little bit. A few years before I started, I went through a database that the state keeps for all the oldest buildings. And I made from that a list of the 100 oldest buildings according to that database, which had a couple of flaws with it. And I posted it on my personal social media, and then you posted on the Boston History social media, and it blew up. And I was like, okay, there's something here. Realizing that 100 buildings was going to be too much to research, I started looking to see, has anybody actually done this?
Right.
And nobody had. There's definitely books about old buildings in Boston. There's books about lost buildings in Boston, but nobody attempted to just try to find any old building, quite literally. And the part that I was most excited about it was how it didn't just look at the Old South and the Old North, but it also looked at random houses that just missed the bulldozers by chance on the edges of town. And I just thought that that was a really exciting way to see the different neighborhoods, but also how preservation exists and is active and accidental. And it just all came together as something that was really fun to write.
It is great the way you go into different neighborhoods. So is there anything that surprised you in looking around the city beyond the familiar suspects?
So I live in the Lower Mills area of Boston, down in the Dorchester region, and I was really shocked at the concentration of old buildings in that one spot. Like, I knew there was old buildings, you see them, they're kind of odd, but like, so many of them have been transformed over the years. I always joke that like they get a hat where like somebody has added an entirely new roof line to it. But yeah, the two things that were surprising to me was just how concentrated some of these areas are, but also how interconnected everybody seems to be. I always joke that there's 5 people in Boston, because even though you're in Dorchester or Roslindale or even in Allston, you're still seeing the same people brought up, even though they're unconnected at all, really, but they're still coming up, and it makes Boston feel like a much smaller town, which it was. But I was really shocked at how many of the players kept coming back.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about how you find out a building's history?
Sure. Yeah. So one of my starting points is a system called the Massachusetts Architectural Resource Macris. It's called Macris. We're going to call it Macris. And that is a basic inventory of all the historic buildings in Boston. A lot of that's done through the Boston Landmark Commission getting funding to create these inventory forms. And from that, you kind of build outward. A lot of them are kind of reported to be a certain date or approximately a certain date. So for those, I really wanted to confirm. So there was a couple buildings that were in the list from the North End or the West Roxbury that ended up getting cut from the book because when I researched them, they just weren't right. And then others that were just kind of surprising. Like they just literally came out of nowhere as I was walking down the street and said, oh, there's one. But it's a lot of trust but verify research. And it was helpful to have that database to really build from. But it was a lot of like work to do all the additional research to kind of make sure that those were accurate.
And you also took a lot of the pictures.
Yeah, I did. I was telling you earlier that I had gone out in February, during February vacation. Nobody's out. It was like 10 degrees outside, freezing, and I was like, this is my chance to go around Boston and take pictures without people in them. So I didn't want to have 1,000 people in every photograph. And so I quite literally froze running around the city. I even took a couple of night shots of the old State House with absolutely nobody in the photo, not knowing that within 1 month the entire world was going to shut down and nobody was going to be outside. But fortunately, I had all those photographs because we literally couldn't go outside during that time. And so I joke that this is in some ways my COVID project, because I sat in my basement with archaeology is hard to do from inside, and wrote most of the book from my basement, which was convenient.
That is. Now, you mentioned no people in the photographs, but one of the things you also talk about is this history of the city isn't just buildings, it is people. And you mentioned the 5 that you found out, but what else? I mean, in the history of the buildings, any particular stories stand out to you?
I'm going to jump ahead to a couple of slides, actually, that I thought was really exciting. We're going to go a little out of order. Bear with me. We're going to go flying through things. We'll come back to everything, I promise. And yes, you did just see Star Trek. Sorry, yes. Don't want to make that mistake.
People are excited now.
Okay. So this particular building was one that I was really excited to find out more about. It's been known for a little while. This wasn't a surprise to the people of Allston Brighton, but I didn't know about it before writing this book. And this is also an example of a building that I think when you approach historic preservation as preserving stories, which is what I really really push for, then it becomes more than just preserving old buildings. It becomes a lot more than just preserving the best looking buildings, because we really need to separate historic preservation from pretty things,
Right.
because that's not the only thing. That's a good thing, but like there's so much more to it than that as well. No one's going to consider this building to be the nicest, prettiest building in Boston, but
Or
it is
even in
one of
Brighton.
even in Brighton, yeah. But it is really one of the more remarkable buildings in the entire book. So this is known as and I have notes because I don't remember anything, as the Brighton Parsonage. So it was actually built around 1790. It was originally lived in by John Foster and Hannah Webster Foster. Somewhat interestingly, they moved to this house. This is number 38 from the number 10 oldest building. Again, there's 5 people in the entire city. So they show up in 1790, and in 1797, Hannah Webster Foster writes a book called The Coquette, and I think, yeah, so this is the book. You'll notice that she's not given credit on the title. It's just a woman from Massachusetts. This actually is the first American-born woman to publish a book in America.
And it's considered one of the first American novels.
Yeah, and it's scandalous. And in the early 19th century, it was so scandalous, it was the second most popular book other than the Bible. And it's about a pastor's daughter who has a love triangle with 2 men. She ends up having a child out of wedlock. She flees town. She gives birth, has a stillbirth of a child at a tavern, and then she herself dies. It's a real uplifting story.
Yes.
But it was written there in Alston, in Brighton, in 1797. It wasn't until 1866 that she actually got her name credited on the front cover.
Wow.
And by then she'd already been dead for 2 decades.
Wow.
So these buildings are, to me, the story here is that these buildings survive. And yes, this could be just a plaque that says here around this area or around this empty parking lot, this is where a book got written by this person. But the building is the home that she lived in, and she is writing about the struggle of a young woman in society with all of these kind of cultural pressures in this home where she's also living herself. And I feel like there's a real connection to that space. And it's not the prettiest building, but it's a really important building for that
And from
reason.
this angle, you get more of a sense of the parsonage, what it looked like.
Yeah, this one got really spruced up. So originally it would have looked kind of like your typical box with the triangle on top without that little side bridge across the roof line. It got what was it called? Colonial revival, essentially, where everything kind of became a little bit more triangular and squares. And so they spruced it up in that kind of 1840s style, and then smacked the storefront on the front of it, which is really functional, but is not adding much to the building when it comes to style.
Does someone live there now?
I believe so, yeah. It was occupied back when I walked by it last time, but and I think the storefront is as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's the range of dates of the houses or buildings you cover?
Yeah, so the oldest one is 1680, oh boy, 1681, I want to say. It's definitely the Blake House in Dorchester. And then the most recent one is like a 5-way tie for 1794. We had kind of an epic battle towards the end of the writing when I was working with the Dorchester folks and the Charlestown folks, and everybody wanted their last piece in the book. And so I had 5 buildings that were in Charlestown at the end of the book, and then there was 1 building in Dorchester that was number 50. And Charlestown was really pushing for me to upgrade this one to the list because of a couple of research points. And finally, they found some research that kind of gave it the final push to put it into the book. And so the Dorchester book the Dorchester building in Lower Mills that was going to end on got pushed off at the other end. So when I started, it was actually the Otis House in West End was going to be at the end of the book. But by the time I finished, it was maybe 3 or 4 buildings out from the 50. Yeah, so a lot of new things got added in. One of the things that I'd like to cover in the book is kind of the history of historic preservation too. I'm going to jump around a couple slides again, so whiz through everything real fast. So Boston is really like a hotbed of historic preservation. That's why we're here today. That's why this book is doing so well. It's why my office in the City Hall is here and is thriving. But it came at a lot of great cost. Yeah. So one of the things I wanted to cover in the book was kind of where the origin stories of historic preservation are. And for us, it's really the Hancock House, which is kind of a tragic loss in the story of buildings in Boston. It was built in 1735, so it definitely would have made it on the list if it had been kept and not torn down. Essentially what happened was when John Hancock passed away, he didn't have a really strong will to say what should happen with the house. And so it kind of got stuck in like probate limbo. And ultimately, it was supposed to be picked up and moved. In fact, the broadside on this image shows people begging for this building to be saved and potentially moved. And then it was sold for 2 lots. And it's now the area where there's 2 brownstones right on the edge of the State House where it is today. And unfortunately, it was torn down in 1863, and it was really a national tragedy that people were like, how could you tear down the John Hancock House?
People did buy pieces of it.
Yeah, and that's been the excellent thing about it, is that there are bits and pieces of it around. In fact, Revolutionary Space has hosted an amazing reconstruction of the front door and brought into that reenactment of the space and how it was seen and felt and experienced. There's a set of stairs in JP that actually came from the house. So there's bits and pieces of it all around.
I think Oliver Wendell Holmes said it still exists, but it's in a million pieces.
Yeah. And there's a scale remake of it. I can't remember what town it's in, but I think Ticonderoga maybe. But you can go there and walk around a completely falsified one. But that was really like the first real push for, we need to do something about this historic preservation thing. And then because we're here, we have to talk about Old South's preservation because it's too important. So I just have a couple slides about this I wanted to share. So not even 10 years after the loss of the Hancock building, we had another test of historic preservation in Boston. There was the Great Fire of 1872, took out most of the area. And from where we are on Milk Street, which you can stand outside today and look down this exact same view of this image on the left, on the right, excuse me, and see just how close the devastation of the Great Fire of 72 came to the building that you are all currently sitting in. And there's an amazing drawing on the left that actually shows people on the roof of this building working to try to keep blankets on the tiles and the I think it's a slate roof at the time, to stop the embers that were quite literally falling from the sky from setting this building on fire. So there was a great effort to save this building. But it wasn't very long. So 2 years later, the congregation had moved to New Old South, which is down in Back Bay over by the finish line. And the building was sold for scrap in 1876. So just after saving it from this amazing fire, it had 60 days to be demolished. And so the people of Boston, of course, were horrified by this. They had speeches in this very room. They raised $420,000 in 1870s, which is an incredible amount of money. But ultimately, it was a group of 20 Boston women, and that's literally they're titled the 20 Boston Women, who formed what's now the Old South Association, bought the building, and got it to be saved. And it was the first time in New England a building was actually saved for historic preservation. And there's some really amazing things that also came out of that. So I think, right behind us is a large kind of office building called the Old South Building, or I think that's what it's called. And a lot of what that building stood for, literally, was to help finance this building. So the people actually developed the lot next to it as a financial means of developing or building money for the preservation of this building. So there's a really creative stuff that's been happening.
They owned that land, or how did they?
Yeah, they owned the land, and then they built the office building on top of it as a way to actually help fund the restoration and preservation of this building. And it's a really remarkable thing. And I just love this old photograph because it shows all these kind of pleas, quite literally on the side of the building, for saving these things that are at risk. And it really reminded me of some very recent developments that was happening in Boston, where this very building became a billboard calling for action, calling for marching, calling for protest. And the things that are actually being at threat today, which is institutions, museums, libraries. Actually, just this morning, got my letter from the federal government rescinding my IMLS grant, which I was done with, which was kind of funny. But so no harm, no foul. But just a little extra jab at the end of that. But,
I'm wondering, were there many buildings being saved for historic preservation?
It was a bit of a trend. So one of the other ones that's kind of famous in that kind of realm is Mount Vernon in Virginia with George Washington's house, which had kind of started to fall into ruin a little bit and then got built back up. But it really wasn't until we got into this kind of raw America 250, but back then. So like we're kind of entering back in another phase of this where for the 150th, for the 200th, people, when it gets to those kind of big anniversary dates, there gets to be this like upswell of Americanism and patriotism, and that starts to help protect the buildings. But it tends to be the president's houses. It tends to be the ones that you think of today, at least, that would be a historic museum or a historic house. And I think today we have a little bit, fortunately, a lot of that's been done, which is great. But I think there's a lot more of that upswelling to say who else needs to be recovered, who else needs to be told in the stories of buildings and places and things like that. Yeah.
So you talk about things that are hidden in plain sight. I mean, you've talked about looking around and seeing things and noticing. I wonder if we could talk about some of those places that you found.
Yeah. So I was, this was around February again. I was walking down to Old North, sorry, Old North. And also there's two other houses right behind Old North that were in the book. So I was making my way down to that part of the North End, started to come back down, Tyleston Street, which ends up on Hanover. And Hanover's the big famous food restaurant, Italian food mecca. And I walked past this on the right. And this is actually photographs I took on the day that I walked by it. And I stopped dead because one of the things that I was noticing in a lot of the buildings that I was actually researching was this architectural style. It's not like I discovered it. Everybody knows about it that does architectural. I'm an archaeologist. I had to catch up to these things. It's something called a belt course. And essentially, it's a place in the wall structure of a house where you physically move the bricks out just a little bit to create a little ledge that then the sleepers that would hold up the floors could be stretched across the building. When you're working with all brick, you kind of have to build the places for the wood to fit in. Otherwise, it's just a sheer wall. And so in the 18th century, early 18th century, these were kind of both stylistic but really practical features. Later on, they become a little bit more stylistic as well. I was just driving around Harvard's campus. There's a whole bunch of 19th and 20th century buildings covered in belt courses that are not real. But this is the real deal. So I saw that, and I was like, holy crap, I think there's an old building here. And then walking around the front, this building is one of these like hiding in plain sight buildings. I went to Macris and it said it was 1814. And I was like, well, maybe, but then I looked at why, and it was because there's an 1814 map that shows it. And just because it's on a map, it doesn't mean it's made the year of the map. So I started to do some research on it. And just to give you some of the looks at some of the other buildings in the area. So these are all 18th century brick structures within about a 5-10 minute walk from where we are right now. And you can see that that belt course is really kind of a quintessential early 18th century building. So also if you're in a construction area and you see a facade coming off a building that maybe is like a vinyl siding or asbestos tile, and you start to see bricks with belt courses, let me know about it, because I'd like to know, because I think there's other buildings left in Boston that have managed to get a little bit covered up that are actually from these time periods. So these are all the true 18th century buildings with belt courses, including the building that we're in right now, Old South. And just to show again up close, it's not a continuous one in this case. So back at the Macris maps, you can see the circa 1814 date and a very turned around photograph, unfortunately. And then I started to do some more research on it. And this is a digital Commonwealth image. For some reason, at some point, this building got accidentally named I think it's the
Mather Elliott.
Yeah, the Mather Elliott House. That building used to exist. It was just further down Hanover Street, and that was Cotton Mather's house, which would be amazing if we still had that building. It doesn't exist, and it's not this one.
I think it was a frame building.
Yeah, and it was like tucked between two other buildings. Sorry, and apparently this one was painted white at some point, or very lightly. But this is a classic Georgian brick house. It's called the Grant House. It was divided in half at one point, and two different families from the Grant's daughters ended up owning it at two different points. But until we did this research, we just didn't know that this building was old, that old at least. You know, we knew it's old, but like not. We got it back to 1734. 34, yeah. Wow. And this is 17th oldest building in the city. Wow. Yeah. So there's other ones out there though too, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, I should talk about the buildings that we've added since. Yeah. These were ones that were, well, you'll see. We did lose one building, so just kind of a moment of silence for what is admittedly probably the ugliest building in the book, but still, it deserved a chance, damn it. So this building's in kind of the Dorchester-Roxbury town line on Dudley Street, in between Roxbury's Nubian Square and what's the square in Dorchester with the cemetery?
Oh, yeah.
That one. Everett, the other one next to it.
Yeah.
So anyway, this building was built in 1790, and it just basically got consumed by brick structures. The front of the building got blasted through to make the back of the buildings in front of it kind of have a larger area.
So what is it? Which is the old building we're looking at?
Yeah, exactly, right? So the yellow vinyl-cladded parts are the old building.
Okay.
So if you took everything off, you
Right.
would have had what we call bays, so like 1 bay by 4 bay, classic rectangular house with a very, very shallow hipped roof, which means the 4 sides come in, and it probably would have had a central chimney. But over time, it got very Victorianized and added onto. And so actually, I didn't know it until after the book published, but this was already slated for demolition by the time the book came out. And I think by the time I gave my first talk, it was already gone. So it was already a little bit out of date, but it's an important part of kind of just putting a pin in the date on this book to say, like, this is what was here on this year. And so I had a nice conversation with Sue, the publisher, that when we found new buildings, like, what are we going to do? Because it's going to happen. And so we just accepted that. And we said, we're going to lose some buildings, we're going to find some buildings, and we'll hopefully have a chance. So
Do you know anything about Calvin Bird?
yeah, so Calvin Bird, so the Bird family was a really well-to-do family in that area of Dorchester, which is really kind of, it's where like the Dorchester clap houses are now. So it's kind of on the edge of South Bay. The Bird family just was a family that lived in Dorchester for hundreds of years at that point. They had a big family. They're not as big now as far as like, they're not the Claps, they're not the Blakes, but the families were there. This house really doesn't have a lot of history to it. I actually struggled to get a lot more information out of it, simply because Calvin Bird doesn't leave a lot of records. The building isn't really noted anywhere. So it was a little bit difficult to kind of fill this chapter in, to be honest. But there's a much larger, nicer bird house just behind this one that was demoed well before.
Wow.
So that one's long gone. And then another bird Beale house. There's a couple other families that end up becoming, in part, a observatory. For the head of the observatory at Harvard had an observatory on the back of his house in Dorchester, just behind this one. So like, you end up bumping into things about like space travel, and there's a crater on the moon named after one of the owners of these houses, and it's just like, another one we end up finding out about Judi Dench, and it's just like, how are we ending up with like Moon and Judi Dench? And it was a weird journey from the basement of my house during COVID. But yeah, I wanted to talk about the other editions.
Right.
I'm not going to say much about them because you got to get the book. But here they are. So the one on the left, if anybody follows our archaeology work, we did a lot of work at this particular property. This is 4244 Shirley Street in Roxbury. The big question with this property, and you'll have to look into it in the book, is just how old is it? What is it? And is it tied to enslavement? This is near another building in the book that is very likely an outbuilding related to that. One of the challenges when writing the book was, do we include other buildings on the same property as the same or different? And it was like, no, if it's a standalone building, it's a building. If it's the oldest garage, wonderful, it gets to be number 44. In this case, it's a stable. And then there's a lot of research, and it's still ongoing because we're not 100% certain still what exactly this house is, where it came from, if it's originally in its original location. But we recently landmarked it in the city, which has been great to know that it's protected. And we did some amazing archaeology in the front yard that we're really excited about. And then that one on the right teased me for almost 2 years because I live within a block of this house. And during our COVID walks, I would walk by this house, and I kept being like, "Oh, I know you're old, but are you that old?" And I did a lot of research, and I got it back to about 1790 something, because the cutoff was 94, and I couldn't prove that it was older than that. It's a Georgian-style home which at least means it should be pretty old, but Georgians are kind of like 1780s to like 1810s, thereabouts. It has a little bit of wiggle room, but they're not super precise to pre-1794. And we know it's Georgian because it has that really flat roof. It's got it lifted up a little bit. Everything's really wide and squat, unlike the Federal, which are kind of like stretched this way. Georgians are stretched like this. Federals are stretched like this. Anyway, I couldn't get it past that date, so I didn't include it in the book. And it would be one of 2 Mattapan houses. That's my neighborhood, and I really wanted Mattapan to be in there. And then I got an email from the Dorchester Historical Society because they do a plaque program for their houses. And they were like, "Was this book on your radar?" And was this house on your radar? And I was like, "Yes, it was." A little salt in the wound. And they're like, "Well, we got it back to 17. I think it was 92." And I was like, "How the heck did you do that?" And they showed me. They found another piece of information that I had not come across, buried in some other random document that says the guy basically was like, "I bought my house and then I built my house. I bought my land and then I built my house." I was only able to find him buying the land and then getting, I think it was a mortgage on the house well afterwards. So I'm like, I think he built the house right after he bought the land, but that doesn't mean he did. And I didn't want to be like, definitely. And the other kind of bookend date was like 15 years out. So I was just like, I can't do it. So, but yeah, so he was able to prove it. So I gave him credit for the research in that. But yeah,
I wondered, you've mentioned landmarks. I know Ellen Lipsey, the former Landmarks Commission director, is here. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the process. If you have an historic house, how you would go about landmarking it, and what it means.
Yeah, what it means, what the process. It's an involved process, but it's a relatively structured process. So you just kind of get on the train and follow it. So basically, the way you start a landmark process is you have to create a petition and you have to submit it to the Landmarks Commission. There's a couple ways to create a petition. One of them is through the mayor. One of them is through a commissioner of the Landmarks Commission. But the most easy and traditional way is 10 Boston voters sign the petition, and that starts the process. And so it has to be accepted by our office, which means it has to pass some sniff test of whether it could be. It's not just like this treehouse I built yesterday. From there, it's a pretty prescribed process, but essentially what happens is there's an initial vote by the commission as to whether or not it will accept the petition, and then we have to do a study report. And that study report is a pretty involved document that does a really in-depth research on the house, on the building, on the boat, on the train, whatever it happens to be, the clock, the landscape. And it not only talks about what is the history of this space and why is it important, but then it also has a kind of prescriptive part at the other end. It's like, so here's everything we think is nice and important about this place. Therefore, it has what's called standards and criteria. And that's essentially the part where we say, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do. And that can be really controversial. So oftentimes we do exteriors only because interiors, that's people's homes sometimes, and they don't want to, like, I can paint my kitchen whatever color I want. But places like Old South, where you've got like a really beautiful interior and public may have that component be part of it. It has to go through the process. It gets reviewed publicly. There's a research component. And then once it's officially designated a landmark, if you do any changes to something on the standards and criteria list, then that project gets submitted to the Landmark Commission to determine if it's appropriate. There's whole neighborhoods that are landmark designated. So like Beacon Hill, Back Bay, your door color is regulated essentially. And there's a lot of lower amounts of criteria as well. So like some places we're not going to go too crazy over, exactly what, texture of paint there is. And then there's some really high level ones where it needs to, I know at the Blake House in Dorchester, if a piece of plaster falls off the ground, that plaster is going back up on that wall in that same location by a conservator because that's how important that building is. It's the oldest building in Boston.
But there's a tension between wanting to preserve things and then someone wanting to be able to live in the house.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like historic preservation cannot just be taking a glass jar and putting it over top of the city. Like the city has to grow, the city has to adapt. The city has to accommodate things like climate change. Buildings that are old are in the way of climate change, and we need to be able to figure out ways to protect those buildings but to also make sure that when we're designing around them, we're not making it worse for those buildings as well. So there's a lot of like nuances, and the best thing about it is that the Landmarks Commission staff are really thoughtful about this process. Like no one's there to ruin someone's day, but it's also like a group of people that can that are aware of the options and can really help guide things into best practices.
I know you wanted to talk a bit about the whole evolution of historic preservation, the idea and what kind of things have gone well, what kind of things are challenging. And I think we're all curious to see why Star Trek fits into
why I put Star Trek in there. Yeah, so this is nice in these kinds of presentations because I can't publish photos that are that I can't publish, but I can talk about them, so I'm going to. Yeah, so one of the things that I kept coming finding, in the research was that you would have these old buildings, especially the really well-known ones, like Old South, like the Old State House, like Faneuil Hall, these like real iconic old buildings of Boston, Paul Revere House, Old North. People have been working on those buildings for usually 200 years at this point. I think up until about 1800, many of these buildings kind of got along as is. And then around 1800, it was like, okay, these are not going to stand anymore. And so that's when you start to see some initial rounds of preservation. But what the real like professional level conservation preservation things really kicked off in like the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Again, that's in that same time period that we have a real push for the bicentennial. We also have a lot of people that are now professional historians, professional historic preservationists and restorers. One of the trends that came out of that, which is actually very visible in this room, is this overemphasis on white. There's been a lot of whitewashed interiors in most of the old buildings that you go into. It's just white everywhere. That's a term called presentism. So what happens is anytime someone tries to do something that is as accurate as possible, it's almost impossible for somebody to not leak into their own personal style, ideas, thoughts. And so in this particular case, I thought these visuals were really helpful to show what in the 1960s a very futuristic and a very ancient style would look like, but they are very much 1960s, especially in the hair. So these are meant to be accurate, forward-thinking. Let's go with the most like bizarre futuristic hair we can. They got the beehive from the 60s. Liz, oh my God, Taylor, thank you, wow. She is very much in the 60s hairdo and 60s eye makeup, regardless of the fact that she's Cleopatra from, 48 BC. They are signs of their times. And that's what you see a lot in these historic buildings. During the classical revival period in America in the 60s, 50s, 40s, 70s, it was very popular to paint things white. And that was meant to be reflecting on the country's history. We have the White House. We have all these ideas that there was white paint everywhere. The reality is most of it was off-white, if it was even white at all. And so a lot of these places just got whitewashed because there was an assumption that that was what it looked like back in the day. And there's some amazing work. If anybody has a chance to do this, you have to go out and see it. Going on at Old North, that recent analysis under the white paint of the arches inside the actual sanctuary have revealed these unbelievable, colorful, original painted cherubs in the corners of these buildings. They've done additional work kind of around, and they realize now that the columns were painted in a faux wood texture, that there would have been a lot of color on everything. It would have been actually kind of Victorian almost, with these like browns and darker colors, but before that, everything was white. And so they're restoring back all the cherubs. I think they just finished like last week or so. So please go down there and take a look at them. They're incredible. But that also gives us a chance to have our own kind of current day presentism, which is essentially looking at diversity and inclusion. So that's going to be something that we're going to be able to reflect on this time period in the future. So for example, in this case, this is King's Chapel, another kind of whitewashed interior that are looking towards options for how to interpret the presence of enslaved people in the church throughout its history. So using that kind of archway at the top of their ceiling as a canvas, it goes into depth as to like why the birds, et cetera, but that's now becoming a canvas for that storytelling of the presence of enslaved people in King's Chapel. Because even though people might see the left as being the original, that is an interpretation from the 20th century of what that could have looked like. And so they're just continuing with that.
So I'm not clear, the birds were there or they're?
No, the birds are being added.
I
So
see.
there's both a going back to ways that it could have been, like at Old North,
Right.
but also taking this as it didn't look like this. We shouldn't need to preserve it like this. So if we don't know what it was, or if we don't want to go back to the original, let's use this as a chance to say something new today,
Okay.
because it is an original, essentially. And then this is a great example, I think, of a famous building here, the old State House within the Revolutionary Spaces, of the way that same room looked about 100 years apart, to show you kind of what style changes there are as we understand the history of furniture and design and decor. And I remember when that building interior came to our office 10 plus years ago, we had an internal conversation about the drapes, because we were like, what do drapes look like in 1724? And like, we didn't know, so we had to rely on the folks that were doing all the research, because we're like, we're just gonna have to trust that that's accurate, because none of us are drape experts. But yeah, you can see how that it's a pretty subtle space still, but there's now so much more information available and studies that have been done on these historic places that we can say that we can do a better job at restoring them. But I still think that 50 years from now, people are going to go, oh my God, you wouldn't believe what they did in 2020. And somebody like me will be making fun of things that we did today. But the reality is, like, it's always going to be a sign of our time today, even if you're trying your damnedest to not do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've already talked about the Brighton parsonage, but I know you also wanted to talk about some other buildings. I mean, you have an historically significant building, but it's not necessarily very interesting architecturally, or it's in bad condition, and which I guess you do run across.
Yeah, so the one I pulled out for that is the Clapp Field House, which I think is going to be a really fun one to follow along. So this one I was aware of right before starting the book, because I'd seen it on Macris, and I was really excited to dive into this one. So the building on the left is in Dorchester at the Fields Corner area. It's one of the T-stops, if you're familiar with that area. The building on the right is the same building, which took a really long time to make sure, because I didn't believe it at first, because it's like, okay, this is clearly a wood building. This is clearly a brick building. We're still not 100% certain if the brick was under the wood originally and the wood was covering the brick, or if it's some sort of like tile on top of it. But I believe it's actually a brick building that had wood siding on top of it. And a good example of that is the Clapp House in Dorchester, the Roger Clapp House.
Right.
Nope, the Lemuel Clapp House, the one I lived in that I should remember the name of. The Lemuel Clapp House. They would use wood siding on the sides of the building that faced the nor'easters, because the bricks would absorb all that salty air, and eventually they would just explode. The salt gets into the brick. Anybody that has a brick basement, the Old North I know has been dealing with this. The salt comes up from the ground, it comes in from the air, and that salt water gets into the bricks, and when it goes from liquid to solid, it grows just a tiny bit as a crystal. And so essentially it gets into those bricks, and it just kind of flicks off little pieces of brick. And fast forward 300 years, your bricks are falling apart. So what people would do is they knew that was going to happen in a hurry, so they would cover those walls with wood as just an added layer of protection. So anyway, this house was facing, I think I've got another picture here. This house was facing the actual intersection. And eventually it got moved back in the yard in order to build a kind of much larger storage facility, and that's still standing. That building has a very kind of plain brick exterior. So there's active work right now to restore that, I think it's the Aarons Warehouse, into something like a mixed-use space, because the top floor is kind of like this. It's a big open space with big windows. And restore the house in the back of it to something like what it used to look like, and then do a really conscientious filling of the rest of the yard, because we need more housing in Boston desperately. And this creates some spaces behind it. You can see it's mostly parking lot. So that parking lot will be turned into essentially a housing area. And we're really excited, because we were in the discussion about how to address that site with archaeology, because there could be something there from the field house when it was there, or the ancient native Massachusetts stuff that was there before that. But again, these houses are, they need a hug. So it'll be interesting, and we have this amazing photograph that we can then use to help inform how to restore it. And frankly, one of the easiest and funnest parts about writing this book was that we have so many really good photo archives of Boston, between the library, Historic New England, the archives. Almost every photo in this book came from one of those three institutions that weren't ones that I took myself. And the amazing people to work with, and it really helped create an actual visual interesting book out of everything too. Yeah. Taking on water. But with that kind of transition of looking at houses in a new way, I think one of the other things that we're also really struggling with is one of my latter slides with Faneuil Hall. Part of the changing things that are happening in the community today is how do we commemorate things. We're going to be doing the 250th soon. We can talk about that too. But Faneuil Hall is really the kind of like the obvious thing that is still kind of being held as a place where we have to have that conversation about what is in a name, what is in a legacy, what is in a building, what matters, what parts need to be saved. Not going to solve it here today, nor do I want to, but it still is part of that story. But I think the challenge with this building in particular that I think is hurting the conversation is the isolating of one place and one person as being the problem. With what we've done with slavery research in Boston is really established that Peter Faneuil may have been one of the worst, if not the worst, offenders. He was one of many. And that we really need to make sure that people understand just how implicated Boston, the rulers of Boston, the laws of Boston were part of this, and to do what needs to be done with Faneuil Hall, but not make it be just about that building or that person. And one of the buildings in this book actually is a gatekeeper's house from Benjamin Faneuil, way out in Alston, Brighton. After the story is actually really cool. So Peter Faneuil's uncle was named Andrew, and he had a massive house like right over there. Andrew did not want his nephews Peter and Benjamin to marry because Andrew was a confirmed bachelor, and so Andrew said basically, as long as you stay single, you'll inherit my wealth. Andrew was loaded, like one of the most wealthy persons in Boston. Peter decided to never marry and never had kids. And so when Andrew died, Andrew gave all of his wealth to Peter. Benjamin fell in love. Benjamin married. Benjamin got a nickel, literally, in the will. The problem, though, is that when you have no heirs, by definition, there's nobody to receive your goods. And so Peter Faneuil ended up receiving huge amounts of money, despite the fact that he already had a huge amount of money from Andrew. Peter dies pretty soon afterwards, and it all ends up going to Benjamin. So Benjamin inherits all of it anyway. He buys a massive estate out in Brighton. He builds this big mansion. He has, I think it's like 4-foot wide paneling in his dining room. And we believe he inherits Peter's 5 enslaved people. Peter's will doesn't actually mention the names of any of the enslaved people because, of course, he didn't. But we do see from Benjamin Faneuil's documents. So Benjamin is not a good person. Just want to put that out there. But Benjamin is actually going to the newspapers because his slaves, who are probably Peter's, are escaping, and he's putting out ads saying like so and so is lost or has run away, and this is what he looks like, and he's a scoundrel, and you need to bring him back. And we think that at least some of those people are probably Peter's enslaved people as well. And the fact that out in Brighton is this gatekeeper's house, which would have been a house where the person whose sole job it was to manage the gate and probably do some driving for Peter lived. The long and the short of it is now that house is likely a place of enslavement as well.
But the Benjamin Faneuil mansion no longer exists. So.
No, well, it does.
Okay.
In my opinion, underground.
Underground.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
you're an archaeologist.
I'm an archaeologist. It's not gone until it's gone. So that's one of the places that we're actually looking at, because next to the estate is next to the gatekeeper's house is a massive open space.
Okay.
It has lost the footprint of the building. Archaeologists like backyards. Front yards are the most boring place you can dig. Nobody leaves trash in their front yards. Right. Archaeologists like trash. So we go to the backyards where everyone throws their stuff. So the house's footprint is gone. There's actually a really amazing photograph when they built these apartment buildings in front of it. They cut back the land, and you see this nice little cliff in the cut, and then there's like a perfect little rectangle of the Benjamin Faneuil Estate basement, and then behind it is just an open field.
Wow.
All of that's still there.
Right.
So we're hoping someday to have a chance to do archaeology in that area, just because it's going to be all of Benjamin's outbuildings. So the barn, the buttery, the milk area, the other buildings. I'm an urban archaeologist.
Okay,
whatever
yeah.
else people have in
Right,
farms,
yeah.
but more importantly, the places most likely where his enslaved people would have lived and worked,
Wow.
which I think would be really exciting to look at.
But you do have the gatekeeper's house in the book.
The gatekeeper's house is in the book. It's not landmark designated. That may change, but it's in the book. It's like, I think, right around the middle part. I can't remember where. But very few of the buildings in this book are actually landmarked.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, in fact, most of them aren't even nationally register listed. So, one of the questions that I had at the end of this book is like, now what do we do?
Right.
Because landmarking is like the ultimate protection, because it's literally like, what color can your window be? That kind of thing.
So is there a difference between being a city landmark and being on the National Register?
Massive difference. Yeah. So National Register listings are essentially a really nice thing, and not a lot more than that.
Right.
So when you are listed on the National Register, you're quite literally put on a list that says these are the most important buildings. If the next day you wanted to tear down the building, you could tear down the building. You could take it off, you could move it, you can do whatever you want to it. What it does what it does do is it creates a thing in the way if there's a federally funded project that comes along and they get to the point where they have a National Register building in the way, like a highway, for instance, they have to do something about it. That's it. So like that mitigation might be, it wasn't that great, actually, let's tear it down. That mitigation might be move it. That mitigation might be record everything we can about it, which is the HABS documentation, and then tear it down. It just creates some protections in the federal thing. But it doesn't actually inherently stop things from happening. There's National Register listed buildings being torn down every single day. Tearing down a Boston landmark would be very difficult to do and would have a lot of repercussions. It's basically not allowed unless it goes through everybody first. It's an inherently stronger protection, and that's really the reality of a local rule versus a national rule. The National Register is a national acknowledgement, so it's a little bit lighter on that front.
Is there a benefit to me as a homeowner to be on the city register, have my building landmark? Aside from having a really nice building.
Yeah, you would definitely have a nice place. The benefits are you get to attend a lot of hearings. No, honestly, it does help provide staff with you get basically a group of people that are going to be able to help you a little bit on things. And whether or not you're into that, the neighborhood tends to be more expensive because of it. Sometimes there's a lot of work that we're trying to do to make that not be an automatic thing, because we don't want to push people out of a neighborhood. But it's really trying to capture the most important buildings in the city, or places, really. Yeah.
Okay.
I think we should switch over to some Q&A if we have a little bit of time, though, right? I'm getting the signal.
I have two questions. One is, when you find an archaeological site like you did at Faneuil Hall, how far do you have to dig down to find stuff? And second, you talked about all the stuff in boxes. Do you ever display it?
It really depends on what happened after the stuff went into the ground. So if there's a lot of demolition, it piles up very, very quickly. If there's not much happening, it can be sitting right on the surface hundreds of years later. So I don't have like a depth to predict. What I actually do is I use the stuff in the ground to actually date as we go. So we have a list of dates in our heads, like creamware is from 1762, pearlware is from 1775. If I get a coin, I get a little cheat sheet. But as I go down the ground, I'm actually dating the site as I go to know where I am in time. And that's how I can assign depths to dates. And so when we're digging in Charlestown next month, we're going to be digging down, looking at the artifacts and going, okay, hopefully it'll go in order. 20th century, 19th, 18th, oh, there we go. Okay, and then hopefully if we find a nice burn layer from the burning of Charlestown, we can say we're there. The other question about the stuff, we have so much stuff. So right now, We have artifacts in exhibit at the Leventhal Museum, the new exhibit on maps. I can't remember the name of it. I'm so sorry if anybody's here from Leventhal. There's a new exhibit on the Revolution in maps. It's a great exhibit. We have a set of artifacts there. We have artifacts that are going into Old North in the next month or so for an exhibit on childhood. We have our own museum-ish at our lab, which is out in West Roxbury, that has artifacts from the James Garrett site, which is a 17th century site. And we just had a really interesting meeting with a really big group of people that I can't say yet about adding more artifacts to a really big institute's public stuff. So there'll be more coming. We're really getting the word out. These kinds of events really help kind of talk about these things, which is really helping us get more stuff out into the public.
So I have a fantasy question for you. You've been researching, has there ever been a building or a landscape that you've said, oh, gee, I wish that still existed so I could include it in my book? What's your dream place that, if you could change time, would still be there and you could include in the book?
It would be, I think it was called Webster Street. So if you're out on Friday for the 250th, Webster Street is now the Prado in the North End. It used to be so narrow that you could walk down it and just touch the buildings on both sides of it. It was kind of like the grungiest, worn down part of the city. It was literally chosen for the Prado because of that. It was one of those like, let's clean up the city by erasing the poor people situations. So that's what they did. They took out all of those poor people's homes. I feel like that is such an interesting place. And when they were recently doing the renovations to that entire area, they were going to take up all the bricks, and I was like, this is my chance. So I immediately emailed the Parks Commissioner, and I was like, let me have it before you do anything. And he's like, oh, no, that's not how it works. There's a slab of concrete about a foot down across the entire thing. We just go back down to the concrete and then put new bricks on top of it. He's like, so we don't mess with the concrete. And so I lost my chance to do that. But that concrete protects what's under it, too. So if somewhere down the road we go really crazy with it and take the concrete up, I'll be there. But I feel like that's the place where we have the least amount of knowledge about who those people were, what their lives like, the least recorded, the most struggle of anybody in the city. There's an incredibly diverse area of the city as well. So like it would be an amazing place to do archaeology. It may still be possible, but it's definitely gone now. I think it'd be interesting to just see it for like 1 second. I'm not one of those people that want to go back into time. I think things are horrifying every time period, basically, and I have no desire to go back in time. But that's one of the ones I'd like to get like a 1 second glimpse of and then disappear again.
We have another question.
I'm curious about the custom house. How old is the custom house?
What part?
Any part.
This may be something that somebody else may know more than me. I believe the lower part is Greek Revival, which is quintessentially 1830s, 40s. The upper part was built in the teens, right?
1914, yeah.
Yeah, on top of it. So it got a hat. Really nice tall hat, but it's got a hat. And one of the cool things about that part of the property, or about that part of the city, is when it was built, it was right on the water, because that's why it was the customs house. The boat would go right up to it. So it's a really cool marker for where the land ended at that time period, but it missed the book by almost 50 years.
Hi, can you tell us about the digs you have planned and how people can get involved with them?
Sure, yeah. So April, May, June, we're going to Charlestown. You're going to hear a lot about it. So what we're actually doing is a twofold series of surveys. We're going to be digging at house sites related to the burning of Charlestown in 1775, and then we're also going to be looking at sites related to the Battle of Bunker Hill itself. So specifically, we're looking for mass burials of fallen soldiers. We believe 2 places where they were buried in large quantities. About 300 people are buried somewhere in Charlestown. We believe 2 areas really concentrate those burials, and we're going to be doing radar surveys on top of those, which is basically like a sonogram of the ground to figure out what's there. It's kind of like that first scene in Jurassic Park where you drive the machine over the ground and go boom, and like the velociraptor appears, but it's nothing like that too. So we're going to be looking for evidence of burials through the ground without any digging, and we're very close to getting all of our permissions in place to excavate at the Readout site on Breeds Hill, which would be incredible. It's never been seen since the Battle of Bunker Hill, and we think it's still there. We're going to see if we can find it, and you all can come out and see it. If we do,
And in preparation for this, you've been posting on your social media account the surveys of Charlestown you've been doing.
So we started this project about a year and a half ago now. We had the crazy idea of let's figure out where everybody lived in Charlestown so we know where their houses are in Charlestown. And that was a 12-month commitment where we have done deed research for every single square foot of Charlestown and have reconstructed in a digital map every property of Charlestown, all of it. I think it's about 300 different deeds that we've done, and we've color-coded it by whether it's a house versus a lot for cows or whatever. And then from that, we've been able to actually go through and say, where are all the enslaved people? Where are all the single mothers? Where are all the people that ended up in the poorhouse? Where are all the people who are craftspeople? And make maps of all these different kind of people, and then be able to say, well, what do we want to actually research? Like, I really want to know what it was like to be a free woman of color in Charlestown. Let's go figure out where that site is, and then do a survey there. So that's kind of what we're actively doing right now. Like literally earlier today, writing up permits for these things. So.
You have mentioned a million or so artifacts from a big dig. Is there any one stands out that you would like to tell us about?
Catherine Nanny Naylor's privy. So for those of you that don't know, privy is an outhouse. I probably talked about Catherine Nanny Naylor's privy in this room multiple times now, but it's my favorite, so you're going to hear about it again. So Catherine Nanny Naylor is a badass from 1670s or so. She survived spousal abuse and actually got one of the first, if not the first, divorces in Boston history, in the middle of the height of Puritanism, and then she lived alone for the rest of her life. But her privy was found intact in the 1990s, right outside of the North End. And everything in that was intact, but one of the things that we got out of it, which kind of tells us a lot of the story, is a bowling ball. And bowling was illegal at that time. Catherine was not only a little bit of a rule breaker, she was also fabulously wealthy. So it's a story about how Puritans weren't quite so pure as they look on paper, and they were often breaking the rules, especially if they could get away with it if they were wealthy. And Catherine was certainly one of those people. But it's just basically, it just is the opposite of everything you think to see in a Puritan site. And I think that's why I love it, I always joke that, like, no offense, Bob, history is too important to leave to the historians. Like, we need other things too. We need the archaeology, we need the oral history, we need all these other pieces to come together. And Catherine's site's one of those sites where you have the written history, and the stuff that's in that site just says not so much, yeah, a little bit, not like, it counterbalances everything that you have written about that time period and gives it so much more nuance, so much more variability. It just shows how much complexity there really was in a time period that everyone has basically turned into, like, this concept of, like, monks and nuns or witches, and that's it. Like, it's a little bit more than that. And people were people back in 1670. And they did things that they weren't supposed to do, and they broke rules, and there was a lot of rules back then, and her site shows us kind of how that worked.
One of the great things about the site, too, is there's a marker on the greenway showing it's not actually where her privy was, but there's a stone.
Yeah.
So just imagine, I mean, it would be pretty cool if in 300 years your bathroom was marked as a historical site.
Yeah, I would always love to, like, interview somebody and just be like, guess what we did? And they would just be like, you did what? Yeah. Yeah. Also, there's all secrets down there. Like, people don't ever think some idiot is going to dig up their outhouse in 300 years. And so they're like, I just wrote in my journal my entire life that I'd never had a drink of wine, but I'll put my 40 wine bottles into the outhouse and see what happens. Or Catherine had 250,000 cherry seeds. We still don't know why. Like, either she was like a industrial pie baker, or she was making cherry hooch on the side. Either way, it's a cool story. So yeah, I like that kind of stuff.
So this isn't really a building-related question, but I'm curious to know if anything in your work, your archaeological work, has uncovered anything about the indigenous people and the Native American tribes who used to inhabit this land.
Yeah, tons. Thank you for that question, too. It's hard to do it with this book because it's kind of building leading. But one of the oldest structures ever built in North America is in Back Bay. It's the Boston Back Bay fish weirs. They were built between 5,600 and 3,200 years ago. They're massive. They're fishing fences that are essentially being built now, more or less, in the spring. And they functioned as fishing nets essentially that were more fence style. So at high tide, the herring and the alewives would swim up the river and then spawn, and at low tide they would come back down, but the fences were in the river and they would get stuck. And so the indigenous people here would be able to collect them by the tens of thousands. But that's not the only site. So I work a lot with the Massachusetts tribe at Ponkapog, and so they're the descendants of the folks that went from Boston, Chickatawba, and went eventually down to Ponkapog Plantation during the 1600s because they were basically pushed out of Boston. It was more or less a trade for selling the city of Boston, was you get this plantation to kind of keep to yourselves. Didn't work out so well for them, but the descendants of that tribe are still around, and we work with them regularly. That said, in Boston, I don't think we've ever dug, our team has ever dug on a site in Boston and didn't find evidence of indigenous people. It scares me that a lot of people before us did not find evidence. And I'm like, I think it was there. But the city's been developed quite a bit. So what we really look for places like the Common, where there's pretty good preservation. The Harbor Islands have relatively little development. So that's an incredible place for archaeology. It's like an archaeological landscape. But we have dozens and dozens and dozens of creations made by Native people that are in our collections. We're working with the tribe on how best to interpret those. We're doing a big project for climate change out on the Harbor Islands about how to address erosion with the tribe so that they're making the decisions along with us about do we dig it, do we not dig it, how do we dig it, what do we do with this stuff once it comes out of the ground, do we put it back, that kind of thing. So it's a lot of kind of long-term relationship building and conversations. But like one of the ways that this is going to play out in the near future, we really want to do a dig out on Boston Common. There's a site that is a Revolutionary War encampment that has a lot of evidence of food. And one of the things I actually just learned, I'm a little embarrassed to say because I had no idea, that women and children were coming over with British troops when they came to Boston to encamp here. I didn't know that. So,
I knew that.
Yeah. You did?
Yeah.
Okay. I figured as much. That's why I was like,
I never told you.
Yeah. But there's areas where there's a lot of food. We are thinking there would have been more likely to have families present in the Common. So that's right on top of a 400 to 1,000-year-old native site. So we want to dig that top site, but we need to have permission from the tribe that it's okay that while we're there, we dig down into the site. So we kind of have a rule that you don't dig half a hole. So we don't stop once we hit to a new site. You dig all the way down. We're actually working on trying to change that process to say we only dig what we have to and leave the rest and make it sure that we have a way of indicating that the site's not dug, it's only partially excavated. Because usually when you see a site marked off as surveyed, you assume it's done. So that's one of the things we're going to have to try to figure out. Does the tribe mind if we poke their site when we're actually looking for Rev War era stuff? Or do we dig a half a site and get permissions from the state who regulates archaeology to do that? Or do we try to figure out a different way of testing that site? Or do we just leave it alone because it's too complicated, that kind of thing? So those are the kinds of conversations that we have because we're working with the tribes.
If I can plug your other book too, The 50 Artifacts, that has one of the points you found on the Common.
Yeah. It's the oldest artifact in Boston. It's right on the cover too, which is really cool. And it came out of the Boston Common.
So Joe, we have one final Zoom question. Does your home in Lower Mills, Dorchester have historic significance?
Future home of the, no. No, it doesn't. It's a 1942 house. I found the plans at the archives. If you have a building that's built after 1872, the plans of that building are at the city's archives. You can actually pull the plans and look at them. It's really fun. No, it's built during World War II. I don't know why they were building houses in the middle of World War II, but mine was one of them. And I do have a native site in my backyard, I should say that. So yeah, that part of it's significant. I put in a pear tree and I found a point.
Well,
so.
Thank you for being here this evening. Joe, I want to congratulate you again on this fabulous book, the second edition. So thank you again. Thank you all. Have a good evening.